What if one of the most powerful men in Africa called you, live on television, and said your story changed his life? That's exactly what happened to Denzel Washington. A call from President Ibrahim Traoré didn't just stop the show, it stopped time. But what followed wasn't a publicity stunt, it became a global movement of legacy, leadership, and love. Stay with us because this is the story you never saw coming, and you won't forget it once you do. The lights were hot under the studio ceiling, and Denzel Washington sat composed in the guest chair, his face lit perfectly, suit immaculate, voice measured. He was on a promotional tour for his latest film, a courtroom drama with undertones of redemption and second chances. The kind of project Denzel had become known for in the later chapters of his storied career. But what happened during this interview would not be scripted, rehearsed, or expected. The host was mid-question a throwaway prompt about legacy when a producer off-camera signaled something strange. An international call was coming through video live and urgent. The host hesitated, then turned to Denzel, who looked confused but intrigued. The name on the screen was unfamiliar to many watching at home, President Ibrahim Traoré, but for those who knew it was a name carrying quiet weight on the world stage. Permission was asked. Denzel nodded cautiously, and the call was patched through to the studio's display monitor. And there he was, in a modest office in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré appeared, not flanked by guards, not speaking behind a flag, just him, calm eyes, steady. He began to speak, and within 30 seconds, the tone of the room changed. "I do not want to interrupt your moment," he said gently, "but I felt the world needed to hear this when you heard it." Denzel leaned forward. Traoré explained that years ago, as a displaced teenager navigating survival in a border town in West Africa, he saw one of Denzel's films, The Hurricane. The story of Reuben Carter, a black man wrongly imprisoned who refused to let his soul be caged. Traoré said he watched it on a grainy screen surrounded by noise and chaos, but everything else disappeared. That film, he said, gave him permission to believe he could be something more than what his world expected. That film gave him the courage to dream. And then he said something that stunned everyone in the studio. "I owe a part of my presidency to you, sir, because your art made me see myself. You reminded me that injustice can be met with dignity, that rage can be tempered by purpose." The camera on Denzel captured what no script could write. His lips parted slightly, his eyes filled. He blinked slowly and tried to hold it back. But it was too late. He broke. The tears came not dramatic, but deeply human. A man who had spent his life becoming other people for the sake of the screen, now being told that one of those performances had sparked the flame in a real-world leader half a world away. The studio fell silent. No one moved. Even the host sat frozen. No follow-up question prepared for this kind of revelation. Traoré wasn't finished. He continued to say that a new leadership school was being built in Burkina Faso, and they had decided to name it the Washington Institute for Justice and Courage. Because it wasn't just your talent, he said, it was your truth. When the screen went dark, Denzel leaned back in his chair, eyes, red voice, hoarse. All he could whisper was, "I don't know what to say." But he didn't have to. The world had already heard. And from that moment on, nothing, not his career, not his mission, not his legacy, would ever be the same. Years before that call pierced the quiet of a well-lit studio in Manhattan, before the world linked Denzel Washington and Ibrahim Traoré in the same breath, there was only a flickering television in a refugee camp on the outskirts of Accra, Ghana. The night was hot and windless, and Ibrahim, then a wiry 15-year-old with dust on his sleeves and the weight of a continent in his eyes, sat on the dirt floor of a makeshift shelter with 20 other boys all staring at a tiny generator-powered screen. The film was The Hurricane. Most of them didn't know who Denzel Washington was. Some couldn't fully grasp the English dialogue, but they understood the emotion, the rage, the isolation, the injustice. And when Denzel, as Reuben Carter, looked straight into the camera and said, "I am innocent," something cracked open inside Ibrahim. It wasn't the words. It was the defiance, the clarity, the sense of self-worth that refused to be buried, even in chains. That night, after the others had gone to sleep, Ibrahim stayed up and wrote a single sentence in his journal: "I will not let this world decide who I am." He didn't know it then, but that sentence would become his personal constitution. It would shape how he studied, how he spoke, how he carried himself. And years later, when he began to rise through the ranks of Burkina Faso's resistance forces and finally stood as a young leader in a fractured nation, that fire still burned from the same source. In a quiet corridor at the UN headquarters in Geneva, many years later, a woman named Selma Bouchard, a North African conflict mediator and one of the few people who had seen Ibrahim's transformation up close, passed a note to a US delegate during a summit on food security. The note had one line: "He wants to thank him, Denzel Washington." It took almost a year, layers of bureaucracy, and the humility of two powerful people choosing authenticity over performance. But eventually a call was arranged, not a press stunt, not a media event, a call meant to be private. But life has its own rhythm, and when the call finally came, it did not wait for a closed door. Denzel, for his part, had no idea who Ibrahim was until that day. Of course, he'd seen the name in headlines, admired his stance on independence and youth empowerment in West Africa, but there had never been a face-to-face, no handshake or handshake photo op. To Denzel, he was simply a stranger with a strong mind and a sharper will. But now, hearing that a performance he had given decades earlier had not only moved someone, but had set them on a path to transform a country that was different. That went beyond fame, beyond cinema. That was soul to soul. After the broadcast, Denzel didn't sleep. He watched the clip back, watched himself cry, and wondered how many other young men had watched in silence, carrying burdens in places he'd never visit. He called his publicist and asked to clear his schedule. No interviews, no follow-ups, no red carpets. Then he made a private call to Ibrahim. "I want to meet you," he said, "but not in a palace, not in front of cameras. I want to see where this really began." And that's how the journey to Dakar began, not as a mission, not as a tour, but as a pilgrimage between two men forever tied by something invisible yet unbreakable, a story once acted, now lived. Denzel stepped off the plane alone. No entourage, no press. Just a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder and a single piece of paper folded in his pocket, a handwritten note from Ibrahim Traoré that read, "Come not as a guest, but as a brother." The heat in Dakar was dense, pressing in like memory. As the terminal doors slid open, there was no red carpet or military band. Just Ibrahim standing by a dusty SUV, wearing a simple white tunic and a grin that cracked the edge of his composure. It was the first time they had met face to face. No words at first, just a quiet nod, then an embrace that said more than any protocol ever could. They drove without a convoy, without security detail, weaving through the humming chaos of the city. Markets spilled into the streets, kids chased each other between taxis, and music from passing radios danced through the open windows. Denzel looked out, absorbing everything. This wasn't a visit, it was an immersion. They didn't go to the presidential palace. Instead, Ibrahim took him to an old, crumbling stone building just outside the city, a former orphanage turned community center. This was where he had spent 3 years of his youth, long before leadership found him. It was here that a woman named Nana Fatou, now well into her 80s, had taken him in, fed him, taught him, and gave him books when food was scarce. She was waiting by the door when they arrived, dressed in faded indigo, her back curved like the crescent moon, but her eyes impossibly bright. "You're the man who taught my boy how to fight without a fist," she said to Denzel, gripping his hand with surprising strength. He could barely hold back his tears. Inside, children were still playing. Some were practicing their French lessons. Others simply stared at the unexpected visitor in awe. Denzel sat on a woven mat, knees close to his chest, listening to Fatou recount Ibrahim's early years, his stubbornness, his questions, his hunger for meaning. She pulled out a torn notebook with pages yellowed by time. On one, a boy's handwriting scrawled across the top. "I want to be a man who makes the world better than I found it." Denzel read it twice. Then Ibrahim added quietly, "She's the one who raised my fire. You sparked it, but she carried it." They stayed into the evening. They ate grilled fish on the rooftop, drank hibiscus tea, and watched the pink sky turn to deep velvet. The call to prayer echoed in the distance. It wasn't ceremony, it was communion. At some point, Ibrahim turned to Denzel and asked, "Do you know what it means to become someone else's memory?" Denzel thought for a long time, then answered, "I think I just found out." Before leaving, Fatu gave Denzel a woven bracelet from her youth. "It's not for fashion," she said. "It's a reminder that who we choose to love shapes what the world becomes." And as they drove back under the moonlit sky, Denzel wasn't just reflecting on his films or the fame they brought. He was seeing himself through the eyes of a boy who had once sat in silence, found his voice, and used it to guide a nation. The morning light spilled gently through the windows of the University of Dakar, casting a warm glow over the campus courtyard. Students were already gathering, some out of curiosity, others having heard rumors that something extraordinary was about to happen. Word had spread quietly. Overnight, Denzel Washington would be making an appearance, not at a theater, not at a gala, but here at a place where young minds were being shaped, many of whom had never dreamed they'd see him in person. Denzel arrived with Ibrahim Traoré at his side, both of them dressed modestly. There was no announcement, no anthem, just the sound of students falling silent as the two men stepped onto a small stage assembled under a canopy of jacaranda trees. The ceremony had been carefully kept from the press by design. It wasn't about publicity, it was about presence. Ibrahim spoke first. He recounted how during the darkest periods of his youth, the face of Denzel Washington had come to represent something deeper than acting dignity, defiance, and direction. Then, with emotion welling just beneath his tone, he revealed the true reason they were gathered. The university's new Center for Peace Storytelling and Leadership would be named in Denzel's honor. The announcement stunned Denzel. He hadn't expected it. This wasn't a favor or a political move. It was a gesture rooted in something sacred, gratitude made manifest. Moved beyond words, he approached the microphone. He didn't have a speech prepared. He didn't need one. He spoke like a father, a brother, a man carrying the weight of decades of silent impact. "I never imagined," he said, "that something I did on a soundstage in another country would reach this far into the soul of a continent I'd barely touched. But today, I see it. I feel it. I believe in it." He looked at the students, many of them leaning forward wide-eyed and quiet. "You're not just the future. You're the now. You're the reason we keep telling stories. Because the world doesn't change through force, it changes through truth, repeated out loud, until someone believes it." And then, shifting his weight slightly, he added something unplanned. "To honor this moment, I'm creating a scholarship right here for African students who want to lead through art, activism, or whatever path calls their spirit. The only requirement, you must tell the truth, and you must promise to pull someone else forward with you." The crowd erupted not with screams, but with the kind of applause that feels like thunder rolling across a valley. Later that day, Ibrahim and Denzel sat with a group of students under the shade of a tamarind tree. They didn't speak much. Instead, they listened. One young woman shared how she used to hide her voice behind others, afraid her story didn't matter. Another young man explained how his father, once a child soldier, now volunteers at a peace center because he believes his scars can teach. It was clear something powerful had been planted, not just a center, not just a scholarship, but a belief. That legacy isn't about what you build for yourself. It's about what you leave behind for others to grow. And as the sun dipped low, casting golden streaks across the courtyard, Denzel leaned over to Ibrahim and said softly, "This is better than any award I've ever received." Ibrahim smiled, "Because this one breathes." When Denzel returned to Los Angeles, the lights of the city felt different. The glamour didn't gleam quite the same. The red carpets seemed quieter. It wasn't that he'd outgrown them, it was that he had touched something deeper, something the awards and applause could never quite reach. Dakar had shifted his soul, but he didn't stop at memory. Denzel acted. Within weeks, he was on a video call with educators and non-profit leaders across the US, proposing an idea that at first startled them with its simplicity, a mentorship bridge connecting young students from underserved communities in America with peers in African countries, starting with Burkina Faso and Senegal. No grades, no tests, just story exchanges, letters, voice notes, truth-telling between kids who had been told their voices were too small. He called it the Path Exchange. Simultaneously, President Ibrahim Traoré launched a creative writing contest in Burkina Faso open to all youth under 18. The theme, The Person Who Changed My Life Without Knowing It. The winner would receive a full scholarship and the top essays would be translated and published in a book with proceeds going to youth education programs. The first winner, a 16-year-old girl named Aminata, wrote about her grandmother who taught her to speak softly and carry fire inside. She ended her piece by thanking Mr. Washington for teaching her through film that black stories don't end in pain, they rise in purpose. The projects caught fire not in the headlines, but in the hearts of the people. Libraries in Detroit began setting up Dakar desks where students could video chat with classrooms across the ocean. A youth center in Atlanta painted a mural of Denzel and Ibrahim not as celebrities or politicians, but as two silhouettes beneath a rising sun joined by an open book. And then came the letter. In a rare joint move, Denzel and Ibrahim co-authored an open letter published in The Atlantic. It wasn't political, it wasn't promotional. It was a call. We believe in leadership that listens first. We believe in storytelling as medicine, and we believe that greatness at its core is quiet. The letter ended with a challenge. What if the next generation of leaders wasn't built in war rooms but in classrooms, cafes, and quiet conversations between strangers? The piece went viral, not because it was loud, but because it said what people had been aching to hear. 1 year later, Denzel returned to Dakar, not for cameras, not for tribute, but to walk through the center bearing his name. It was thriving. Students from 5 African countries studied storytelling, ethics, film, and conflict resolution. The scholarship program had already supported 24 students, and the mural of Mama Fatou now welcomed visitors with the words, "She gave us roots so we could grow wings." That night, at a quiet ceremony, Ibrahim and Denzel stood side by side in the courtyard. There was no script, no speeches, just candles placed in a circle, each one held by a student, each flame representing a story that would not be lost. As they stood in that circle, the past and the future breathing beside them, Denzel looked to the sky where stars blinked like old souls watching. He whispered, This is what legacy feels like." And Ibrahim, without turning, replied, "Because it's not about being remembered, it's about what you leave alive." This was never just about a phone call. It wasn't even about fame or politics. This was the story of 2 men, Denzel Washington, a celebrated actor, in the twilight of a legendary career, and Ibrahim Traoré, a young African president who had risen from dust and shadows, connected across oceans by something invisible yet unshakable story. It began in silence. A film watched under the cover of night in a refugee camp became a spark for a young man's transformation. And that transformation, decades later, led to a call that cracked open the world of a man who never imagined his art would become a lifeline for a leader. From that raw, unscripted moment on live television, where Denzel wept, an unexpected bridge was formed, a bond that moved beyond admiration and into action. We followed their journey from Dakar's dusty streets to candle-lit courtyards, from orphanage rooftops to lecture halls filled with dreamers. We saw Denzel step away from spotlights to sit humbly at the feet of a woman who had mothered a movement. We watched as a leadership center bloomed in his name and a scholarship gave wings to stories yet unwritten. And we witnessed the 2 of them not as icons but as men deeply changed by one another, But what's most striking is not what they did, it's how they did it with humility, with presence, and with purpose. They taught us that legacy isn't built in front of crowds. It's born in moments when no one's watching, when you decide to listen instead of speak, to show up instead of shut down, to give before you're asked. And the lesson true leadership doesn't always roar, always. Sometimes it whispers. And in that whisper, it changes lives. So how do you apply this to your own life? You don't need to be a president or a movie star to make an impact. Maybe your words, your encouragement, your presence in someone's life is already shaping a future you'll never fully see. Be present in your conversations. Be generous with your truth. And always remember, you are part of someone's story already. Choose what kind you want it to be. Now here's a quick question for you. Which quality do you believe creates the most lasting legacy? A loud, visible achievements. B, quiet, consistent impact. Comment A or B down below. We'd love to know your take and see how others in our community think too. And most importantly, how did this story speak to you? Did it move you, inspire you, challenge something inside you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here, and someone else might need your insight more than you know. If this story meant something to you, please hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us continue creating content that uplifts, that matters, and that reminds us all what it means to live a life worth remembering. Thanks for watching. Stay kind, stay present, and keep listening for the stories that are still waiting to be told.